Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our next Emerging Leaders Club meeting. This club, just to describe it, is it's a community of young technologists and lawyers interested in the world affairs and politics of our country, and who want to ensure that we build technology to make the world a better place. So today I want to introduce our guest, our esteemed guest, Gerard de Graaf. He is the senior EU envoy to Silicon Valley, brings decades of experience on transatlantic and international regulation, and we're very grateful to have him. Gerard.
Thank you, Mo.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted interesting to see you are dressed like we are in Brussels, and I'm dressed like you are in Silicon Valley. This is kind of purely coincidental.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm looking up to you, trying to bring the Brussels to San Francisco.
We need a lot of emerging leadership in the world that we are kind of in and we're entering into. So really pleased also to discuss with you and to hear from you what you think the right course of action is.
Right. So I wanted to begin just by asking, you know, to frame the conversation. What do you do here in San Francisco? Why here and why now?
The simple question, I was appointed and then I was sent here, but of course the deeper answer to this is that the technology is increasingly shaping our lives, our worlds, our societies, our economies, and so it's important for the European Union that the technology is developed and designed in a way which supports our economies, our societies, which kind of technology for good, technology for people. Well, here this is still, with all the kind of say headwinds that we've seen over the last couple of months, this is still like a source of a lot of innovation. Just think about generative AI. Last year we talked a lot about metaverse. People seem to have forgotten about metaverse, quantum. So this is still a major source of innovation, and the EU wants to be part of the conversation here. Where how we are going to make sure that all of these technologies, this innovation, strengthens our democracies. Improves the quality of life of our society and of our citizens in our society. Promotes inclusion and all of these things. So, and we have of course also in the EU. We are of course also a technology power in the EU, but we have also regulated quite recently. In the area of technology, on, for example, platforms, accountability, social media. We are preparing regulation on AI. I'm sure we will touch upon this. We have also, the GDPR you're quite familiar with, to protect our personal data. So in that sense, and because a lot of US companies are very active and very successful in the European Union, but they will have to comply with the European Union rules to be here and to be able to discuss and interact and liaise with the companies, like where they are based, also at a fairly senior level, because of course all of these companies have their own representatives, their government affairs people, their lawyers in Brussels. But to be here to discuss with, say, the leadership of these companies so that they are well aware of what the European Union expects of them and what they will have to do in order to comply with our regulations, that's I think one of the reasons why we are here closely, more here in Silicon Valley. We're also here because there's a lot of academic expertise. We work very closely with the likes of Stanford and Berkeley and UC Davis, and last week I was at UC San Diego, so that also that kind of channel of communication with the academic community is very important to us, where we can learn a lot about the impact of technology on our societies. And then last but not least, if the European Union is a bit of a trailblazer, you may have heard about the Brussels effect. The European Union regulates like we've done with the GDPR, and then many countries around the world take inspiration from the European regulation, or companies like in this country are complying with the GDPR, not because they have to in the US, but they do it because they think it's in their own interest to do so. So if we are say the global regulator for digital, at least the global leading regulator for digital, California is a regulator in the US. It's a trailblazer in the US. So we will talk about that, no doubt. But in Washington D.C., not much is happening for reasons that I'm sure you all know. There's a political gridlock. So this makes the relationship between the EU and particularly the state of California, which is like, if it were a country, it would be the fifth economy in the world, even more important. So two trailblazers talking to each other, trying to see to what extent we can align our approaches, we also think is very important. So it's a long answer to a very short question, but that's why we are here.
Well, thank you very much. I actually want to continue on that last thread that you mentioned. We are familiar with why the United States has been behind on regulation. I'm curious, why is it that, in your opinion and in your view, that Europe is leading this effort in technology regulation and not the United States?
Well, for a very long time, also in Europe, if you look at the big tech companies, they haven't been under a lot of regulation, and it's only since a number of scandals emerged in Europe, and I think as we've seen, say, the power that these companies have on our societies, the effects these companies have on our societies, that the calls for what you call here in the US like guardrails, or many people call that guardrails, but at least to put them into a framework, these calls have become louder. So I think around 2017, 2018, in the European Union, in the wake of Cambridge Analytica, a number of other kind of scandals. The pressure in the European Union, political pressure, but also societal pressure to do something, to regulate these companies, became stronger. And this is like when we then started to work. Of course, we had the GDPR, which came out entered into force 2018, 2016. So it's around that time that we started also to work on Digital Services Act, which is an important piece of regulation that is about the accountability of the platforms. The question that we asked ourselves in the EU was, how can we make the internet safer and at the same time protect our fundamental rights and our right of expression? So how do we do that? I think many countries around the world are asking themselves that question. We asked ourselves that question around 2017, 2018. And we also saw the market power of these companies. In certain areas of like, if you look at marketplaces, if you look at app stores, also social media companies, operating systems, because of the nature of the internet and the network effects, these companies exercise an enormous power in our society. So those were like two drivers. The second was then the question like, well, how can we keep the internet economy open and contestable so that newcomers can come in, and if they're successful, they can dislodge these companies. So it was around, I think, that period of time that it was really felt that the European Union there needed to be rules.
Right.
This industry needed to become a regulated industry. And then there's maybe a peculiarity in the European Union. We have 27 member states. And so if the European Union doesn't regulate or put rules forward, member states will, and they did. They started to regulate at national level, and then the consequence of this is that we have a single market in the European Union. But if member states start to regulate in different ways, it just becomes very difficult for companies to operate and to grow and to scale up, because every time you go to a market in another member state, it's often like mentioned as one of the reasons why we don't have more big companies. Why don't we have a Google? Why don't we have a Meta in Europe? It's because it's just very difficult to scale up because the rules are different between the member states. So one of the other kind of drivers of this was to say, look, we need a single set of rules in the European Union, because otherwise we will never be able to leverage like the large market that we have, the 450 million consumers that we have, which is a larger market than the US. And so to have a set of European rules was another imperative for Europe to compete. And interestingly, maybe on that last point, we see now that Washington isn't regulating, but states are. If you take data protection, privacy as you call it here, 14 states have regulated. California has more or less copied the European GDPR. I mean, Washington state has regulated, Colorado has regulated, Virginia has regulated.
You heard Montana just banned TikTok.
Yeah, Montana banned TikTok. So, interestingly, whereas in Europe we are trying to build the single market from like a fragmented situation. In the US, you had a single market, and if you're not careful, you're losing it because of the states just basically taking action because not enough action is taken at the federal level, and the federal level not being capable to preempt. That's why like the European Union has regulated quite extensively in the field of digital.
Right. Thank you. And I understand the values there, and I appreciate them. I wonder, how do you respond to the sort of many technologists say Europe is stifling innovation, is preventing the development of certain technologies based on fear mongering or.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to use a word that I don't know whether it's in the dictionary, but it's bullshit. Probably it's in the dictionary. I haven't done Webster. I mean, it'd probably be
maybe
that.
The new one.
Yeah, maybe in the new one. Let me just talk from personal experience. I mean, I came here 10 months ago from Brussels, and so this has nothing to do with digital. So you need a bank account, you need a bank card, you need your internet connection, you need like energy, because you move into a house, so you deal with all of the utilities here. I mean, the banking services here in this country, and you may not recognize this because probably you're not used to anything better, are abominable, are really abominable. You may pay $30 for a wire transfer, which kind of is there's no cost. I mean, I took my kids to Bank of America because we were there as a family. They're early 20s, and so the bank manager said, look, I'm sorry, I have to tell you one thing, you get a free whatever debit card, but you can't write checks. And my kids looked at me and said, well, what's a check? They've never written it, they've never seen a check in their lives. I mean, in Europe, I can change my energy provider every day of the week. There's plenty of choice. Here, I can't change. It's PG&E and PG&E and PG&E and PG&E. It's all the same. I mean, if you look at the internet connection, I paid in Europe 1/3 of the price what I pay here for Xfinity, and I don't even have good internet connection in my own street. I have to walk up the street. I live Presidio Heights. I have to walk up the street in order to make a phone call. This is San Francisco. I don't even talk about medical care and drugs and airlines, etc. There's no Ryanair here. There's no EasyJet here. All of these things. I mean, if I go to a general practitioner in Belgium, I pay 30 euros. If I go to a general practitioner here, I'd be lucky if I pay less than 300 euros or $300. So, I mean, why is that, Mo? Why do you think that is? Now I come back to the link between like regulation. It's because we regulate it. We regulated these markets. We injected competition. Do companies like to compete? Do they love to compete? Do they love to compete more in Europe than they do in the US? Of course not. They hate competition. Companies hate competition. So you have to put rules in place in order to make them compete, open up the markets. I think and again I'm going to be politically incorrect here, I think the American people has been conned into thinking that regulation per se is like against competition, is against innovation, etc. I would argue the other way around. This country is under-regulated. You would have much more competition if you regulated some of these markets. This would be the best Inflation Reduction Act you could imagine, rather than throwing kind of hundreds of billions of dollars at it. If you would make some of these markets much more competitive, because prices would come down as a result. So that's, I mean, you see, I stepped onto the hobby horse. I'm sorry about that, because I get this very often, like, well, the European Union, I mean, somebody said to me the other day, we are Silicon Valley and you are Silicon Valley of regulation. So, I mean, we do have a different approach, a different, like, culture, political culture. I mean, the Europeans think about what could go wrong and the precautionary principle and all of this, and then we put some rules in place. The American approach is more like, well, let's see what happens, and if something goes wrong, we'll fix it, and then often you get a knee-jerk reaction, and it's kind of going over the top. So we have these different traditions, but I mean, look also at car emissions, etc. Will car companies voluntarily cut emissions? Well, it's not our experience in the European Union. I mean, how have we prompted innovation in the European Union? By basically forcing them down to lower and lower emissions, and therefore cleaner engines and everything else. I think in the digital era, I mean, you all use interpersonal communication services like WhatsApp and Signal and all of these other things. Has there been a lot of innovation in these markets? It's a bit like in the old days, that kind of, if I would want to make a phone call to somebody who's on T-Mobile, I need a phone for T-Mobile. I need a phone because somebody else is on AT&T. I need another phone because somebody else is on Verizon. These services are not interoperable. I mean, the quality of these services isn't very good because there's no competition. So this is one of the things that we will open up in the European Union. So to think that digital markets are like by nature more competitive, no. We're actually going to inject some rules. We're going to put some rules into this market to make them more competitive and more innovative. So the kind of simple, I mean, it's a bit like wine. I mean, you've got bad wine, you've got good wine. You've got bad rules, you've got good rules. Yeah, bad rules are bad for innovation, but good rules can be absolutely excellent for innovation.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's almost counterintuitive to the American mind that
Yes,
regulation is going to stimulate.
I think it's been planted into the minds of people that somehow regulation must be avoided because regulation is bad.
Right. Well, you know,
and particularly in digital, because this country, I mean, of course, I mean, we talk a bit about technology, but there's a lot of regulation. This country is also heavily regulated. I mean, let's not think that this country isn't heavily regulated in other areas. I mean, pharma, drugs, I mean, before you can put a medication onto the market, it's very heavily regulated, and probably rightly so, because we wouldn't just want to be taking drugs that haven't been tested and checked for side effects and everything else. So this is not a country where there's no regulation, but it's interesting that often in digital, somehow this should be like dealt with separately, where, I mean, nobody would question that we regulate pharma, we regulate energy, we regulate cars when they're put onto the road so that the brakes work, and if you turn the steering wheel like this, the car actually goes to the right rather than to the left. Nobody questions that, but in technology, suddenly when you say, well, maybe we want to be sure that AI is kind of used for good and not used for bad. No, let's push AI into the market just like this. And then if somebody says, well, we think we should regulate AI, I say, well, why should we regulate AI? This is kind of, for us, it's the world upside down. Why should we not regulate AI? A technology that is so disruptive to our societies is going to kind of bring so much change. To think that that should not be regulated to a European is like inconceivable.
Right, right. Well, actually, you've anticipated my next question, which is that how do you know, these digital technologies, people perceive them as necessarily being different than other industries, and I think in part rapid developments in certain fields like AI and others do make them somewhat different. And I wonder, how do these rapidly developing fields kind of change your regulatory approach? An example I would give is, you know, the AI bill that you've been working on in Europe. I believe, if I understand correctly, it had to be rewritten to some extent with the development of generative AI and other technologies that were not originally, you know, framed as part of the deal. And so how do you try to develop regulations and develop a relationship that will allow you to be robust to new changes while also, you know, not getting in the way?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a couple of comments. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about AI because this is, of course, the issue that is on many people's mind here in the Valley and around the world. I think, first of all, I mean, it's not some, like we see something and then we immediately jump and we regulate. I mean, we have been working on AI for like 4 or 5 years with like I mean, we brought experts together. I mean, we started 2018, and we kind of did public consultations, impact assessments, white papers, and everything else. So there's like more than 5 years we've been working on it. So it's not something that the EU kind of discovers something and then overnight it just comes out with regulation. It's carefully prepared. I think the other thing is when we talk about regulation AI, we will never regulate the technology as such. We regulate the use of the technology. So because this is often what you hear, like, you can't regulate AI because it's a technology and the technology moves so fast. You're hitting at a moving target, so don't even think about it. You will fail. Well, we don't regulate AI as a technology. We regulate the use of AI in particular situations. We effectively regulate or will regulate only 5% of all AI applications. Because what do we regulate? We look at AI in a particular context where outcomes of using AI for decision making can have or produce significant material impacts on people's lives. If you apply for a mortgage, or you are in a recruitment procedure, or you have a medical diagnosis, or you're in a judicial procedure, and there's an AI algorithm that basically decides whether or not you can have that mortgage, or whether or not you can actually, you are selected and you do your interview, or you're kind of deselected, or you get medical advice that frankly is quite, impactful on your life. We believe because of the impact, potential impacts, particularly if the AI, for example, is biased in terms of data, the potential impacts on people can be very, very far-reaching. We have had situations, I'm originally from the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the AI was used in order to detect potential fraud with Social Security. And this was so the AI was so biased, it identified lots of people that frankly were not doing anything wrong. They weren't defrauding the government, but they got the full force of the government on them. They were the benefits were taken away from them. They were prosecuted. 30,000 people were victim, and the government fell almost as a result. So these people were significantly disadvantaged in their lives and suffered like traumatic experiences in their lives because of a faulty AI application. So this is the kind of situation. So where AI is used in those contexts, basically then what we would require is it's a bit like with what we do with product safety. We follow the product safety approach. You can't just put a product on the European market. You cannot also not put a product on the American market before it is tested against a particular standard. For example, that it is safe, that if you use a toaster, it doesn't electrocute you, or if you use an elevator, it has like safeguards that if something technically goes wrong, it doesn't just drop down to the floor. All of these things. So they're technical standards, and then what the manufacturers do is they prove compliance in relation. So it's a conformity assessment with regard to these technical standards. If it is not a high-risk product, you can do that yourself. You may have seen boxes with CE marking on it. In Europe you see a lot of CE marking, which is the old Communauté Européenne in French. If it's a risky product, then it needs to be independently certified by an independent laboratory. So we take a little bit the same approach. So we divide the risks for AI in a certain number of categories. There are 4 categories. One is unacceptable risks. This is not the AI. This is not the innovation we want to see. Not all innovation per se is good. In Europe, we don't want to become a surveillance society, where everywhere you walk, you're being you're followed. You don't have your personal freedoms anymore. So that kind of facial recognition. There might be some instances when a terrorist is on the loose, that facial recognition for law enforcement purposes could be accepted, but in general, facial recognition is likely going to be prohibited in the European Union. Subliminal, tricking people into taking decisions that clearly are against their own interest, using subliminal approaches with AI, that will be prohibited in the European Union. Social credit scoring, which is what you see in China, that people are just checked and whether they obey or they act as in conformity with the Chinese Communist Party guidelines, is not something that we want in the European Union. So that is also something that will be prohibited. Then we look at situations of high risks. I gave some examples already, like if you ask for a mortgage, if you go through a recruitment proceeding. Maybe some of you will want to apply to, or you're applying to university, you will want to get into Stanford, want to get into Berkeley or any other university. You will want to be treated fairly. Not because, in Europe, if your name is Mohammed, there are situations where, employers would say, no, I'm not so sure I want Mohammed because of certain connotations that are border on racism and ethnicity. So we don't want that type of situation. So in recruitment procedures, etc., the AI should not be programmed to eliminate all people with like a name that's not a Dutch name or a name that's not a French name by nature. So that'd be high risk, where I'd say the risk assessment would apply. You would have to make sure that the data are non-biased. You have to be sure it's transparent. The procedures are robust. You need to document. Then you have the limited risk. I mean, at the moment, like for example, deep fakes in the legislation as it is now is kind of, you have to identify this is a deep fake. So somebody looks at it and say, okay, I thought it was real, but I see it's a deep fake. Obama is saying very whatever scandalous things about Joe Biden. Nah, it's not Obama. That is like it's a fabricated video. It's a deep fake. And then you have like really minimal risk. And so when I say we regulate only 5%, that's the kind of the high risk and the prohibited. I mean, large language models have come along. I had not heard about ChatGPT until about last November. So this also shows again how fast things move. And here in Silicon Valley, we made a legislative proposal in the European Union more than 2 years ago. So it's again evidence that we don't rush to judgment very quickly. We take our time. It's a system of checks and balances. But because the model, the legislation was based on use cases. So here you have effectively narrow AI. So you use narrow AI for a particular use case. If there's a risk involved, you need to take you put some safeguards in place. Well, there comes generative AI, foundational models. Yeah, it has forced us in a way to reflect to what extent these foundational models are already captured by the regulation. And the answer is yes, they are captured when they are used for specific use cases. You can use generative AI also to assist you in recruitment selection procedures. And then the question was, well, what about generative AI as generative AI? Should there be specific rules because they are foundational models? They're going to be like underpinning a lot of like more specific models. So should there be kind of rules that would kind of take into account the impacts that they have on kind of more on models in general? And here the discussion is still ongoing. I mean, I think there's probably some disclosure that might need to be made. Some are suggesting licensing. Well, if you look at how the technology is going, I mean, if you had asked me 2 months ago what is the biggest concern that you would have, my answer would be concentration. That the companies that are already quite powerful, like Microsoft and Google and Meta, they would become the wholesalers of these large language models and therefore hold a lot of power. If you ask me now, we see, I mean, some call it the democratization. I would rather call it the diffusion of these large language models, as the cost of developing these large language models is kind of reduced significantly. You don't also need as much data. I mean, ChatGPT-4 is developed on the basis of 175 billion parameters. I mean, with 10 or 15 billion or even less parameters, you can develop a pretty good large language model. And so now the question, I mean, we will see these large language models spreading out across our economy. The other day, the United Arab Emirates issued a large language model called Falcon. I mean, who would have expected the United Arab Emirates issuing, I mean, maybe you, and that model is more powerful than ChatGPT. So what we will see is a distribution of these models around the world. So the idea of licensing is a bit more complicated. I mean, by the end of this year, I was at Qualcomm last Friday in San Diego. I mean, they're working on a chip that will have a large language model on it. And so by the end of the year, the first phones will be shipped where you have your own large language model in your phone. And where we will go towards is like you will have your own personal assistant in the phone. It will not be 175. They will start with 10 billion. They'll probably go to 50 billion. But these models will be pretty good. And so we will all have them in our pocket. A year from now, everybody will have a large language model on a chip, if you have a new phone in your pocket. So to regulate kind of in terms of licensing, etc., is going to be very complicated. But maybe still some kind of safeguards. I mean, in the context of the Digital Services Act, for example, because I mean we do not trust the platforms to say, look, all is fine, just believe us, etc. So we want to have independent verification of the claims that they make. So some kind of like, I mean, like access of researchers to data, for example, could be considered in the context of large language models. How have they been programmed? How have they been aligned? How have they been debugged? Maybe at some point also independent external auditors that can come in and look at these programs. So those are like ideas which are still being debated. Next week, the European Parliament is going to establish its negotiating position. The Council, which ministers, which is our member states, which would like the Senate here in the US. The European Parliament is more like the House here in the US. They will come together both with their own texts, based on the original proposal of the Commission, which they redrafted, they amended, and then they go into a process called trilogue, which is like conference that you have in the Congress, and they try to come to a common, a single text. So these issues, I mean, one of the big issues in the negotiations is indeed how can we effectively and adequately bring within the scope the large language models in a way that makes sense and of course doesn't go overboard. So it's challenging, and the aim is to have an agreement before the end of the year. But then, I mean, there's a transitional period, which is typical with regulation in the European Union. In this case, it might be 2 years. So, I mean, interestingly, when I came here last September, I talked about the AI Act. I got this type of your previous question, like, well, why are you regulating? You're killing innovation. I mean, here it's Europe again, and wait and just let and now when we talk about, because also the CEOs of the AI are now, Sam Altman was in Brussels last week. He met with President von der Leyen. He met with Commissioner Breton, who will be out here in 2 weeks. He met with the Executive Vice President Vestager. And what was his key message? You must regulate, and you must regulate really quickly. So the criticism we get now is not that we regulate, but it takes another 2 years before the effects of the regulation will be felt on the ground. So can we fill that space in the meantime? So there's all kind of discussions going on internationally in Hiroshima, the G7, where they are launching the Hiroshima process. I mean, there was a TTC the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the US last week in North Sweden, develop a code of conduct with the industry. The Commissioner Breton, who will be in San Francisco in 2 weeks' time, is talking about an AI pact. We need a bridge here between, because there are significant risks. I mean, I don't want to give examples here, but I mean, we are in meetings with these people, the people who develop these large language models, and I always ask the same question, is how much do you understand about your own model, what it does? How much can you explain about the model that you have developed yourself? And the answer is probably 60%. 40% we do not understand. We have no idea why the model behaves as it behaves. So that's the kind of, and then we ask some questions like, well, what can it do? What it can do well, so what it can do for good, it can also do for bad. You can ask ChatGPT, like, well, for example, with pesticides, make this pesticide less toxic, because I'm not trying to kill like big animals here. I'm trying to kill like little pests, etc. So make it toxic enough to do what it's supposed to do, but not more toxic than necessary, so to promote sustainability. But you can also ask ChatGPT, how can I make this more toxic? How can I develop chemical weapons, biological weapons? How can I kill 1 million people? Of course not, I mean, ChatGPT will put enormous kind of safeguards in place. When you go to ChatGPT and you say, look, I have a little bit of pain here, etc., what should I do? You get, look, I'm not going to give medical advice, go and see your doctor. But with these large language models, you can also remove those safeguards. And that's the big, so the discussions, I mean, that Julia and I and the colleagues have with these companies are pretty scary. What can potentially be done. So if you get the CEOs of these companies to come out to Brussels and travel around the world and say, please regulate us, it is for a reason. As Sam Altman said in his testimony before the Congress, if something goes bad, it can go badly wrong. If something goes wrong, it can go badly wrong. So I'm not saying that the EU AI Act is solving all of these problems. This is more like, well, I mean, often the analogy is made with nuclear weapons, and like after the Second World War, we put kind of protections in place to avoid nuclear proliferation and chemical and biological weapons conventions. And that was complicated, but at least you can keep an eye. I mean, you can't make a nuclear bomb unless you have plutonium, unless you have kind of the materials. Here, the materials are pieces of software and data that are kind of generally accessible. So to control that is much more difficult.
Right.
So that's like a bit behind the AI Act and why we are doing this. And I think whilst in this country, the conversation about AI and regulation has changed dramatically with 180 degrees. 6 months ago, 8 months ago, don't even think about regulating AI, and now we can't regulate AI quickly enough.
Right, right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the perspective there. And I like the idea of regulating the use cases and not necessarily the technology itself. It gives us a less moving target, like you said, to focus on. I do want to yield the floor to the audience for our Q&A section. So please, if you raise your hand, we'll call on you, and you can go ahead and ask a question. Go first. Oh, here, there's a mic.
Hey, my name's Chris. So you mentioned earlier, it was just now actually, these CEOs going around and asking, please regulate us. And that can seem almost paradoxical. Why would they want to be regulated? And there's sort of a argument that I've seen, which is, this is the fox trying to regulate the hen house. What they're doing is they're trying to build up a regulatory moat around themselves to ensure that they stay the incumbents. So I'm curious, when you're meeting with these folks and you're designing regulations, how do you ensure that you're taking the current innovators' knowledge, under advisement, while ensuring that the regulations you create are targeting the right things, they're effective, and they are still pro-competitive?
Yeah. It's a very good question. I mean, we're always a bit suspicious when companies come to us and say, please regulate us, because we always there must be something that kind of behind, and so we don't take it immediately at face value. I think in this case, I think that it is genuine. I think there is genuine concern. I think amongst the technologies that are developing these technology, that they have unleashed something that can bring huge benefits, really fantastic benefits in healthcare. I mean, agriculture, precision agriculture. I mean, we cannot make the shift in our societies to like a low carbon, zero carbon economy without massive use of AI to make our energy system smarter, to improve the energy efficiency in our houses. So there's such an upside also to AI to help us achieve, address the societal challenges that we face together as humanity, as a planet. But I think they are also very well aware about the downsides, and so I'd like to think there's a genuine motivation in all of this, and I think this even more because I have come to the conclusion that there is no guarantee that these companies will come out the winner of this, because as I said earlier, large language models, the Falcon of the United Arab Emirates is a better, according to experts, is doing a better job, is more accurate than ChatGPT 4. And so there's lots of small companies. There's a company called Hugging Face, which is very actively involved in all of this. So the idea, which I would have like 2 or 3 months ago, this race, because you need so much computing power, you need so much data, you need so much investments in all of this. Only the very big ones can afford that. I've moved away from that. I think there are going to be small, medium-sized businesses that are going to outperform ChatGPT. People are in the inside kind of the lane are saying ChatGPT is already a bit overtaken by events. It's not as good. There's better models available. And what you will also see is that, I mean, this is a general model. ChatGPT is just across the board. It's not bad, but it's also not very good at anything. I mean, Bloomberg issued a model a few days ago, which is a model using a large language model, but then training it specifically for financial advice, for financial market applications. So they put in a lot of their own financial data of all of these years of like Bloomberg. Well, this model can do horizontal, and it's probably as good as ChatGPT, but it is tremendously good for, and at this stage things will of course get better at providing like financial advice, investment advice, etc. So it's the idea that somehow, look, okay, we are successful, now let's throw up like a wall around us, and so that the challengers have a harder time to compete with us. I think it's probably true in other areas, but I don't think it's true here, because I think the market is still very fluid. It's not clear to see where it is going, and it's probably unlikely because the smaller companies, the bigger companies have deeper pockets, but they tend to be slower. I mean, the idea that, I mean, even Google, I mean, yes, Google, when it started, and Meta, etc., they were very agile companies. I mean, a company that has 180,000 people staff is not an agile company anymore. They are much slower than the startups, the scale-ups, etc. So the chances that there be others that will actually start kind of dominating, or at least be more successful in this market is significant.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? Please.
Thank you. I'm Vicky. I just want to, before I ask my question, a quick way I've been reframing the idea of regulations here is like governments developing infrastructure that protects citizens, right? Like it's like a way to think about, it's like not rules, it's like we are protecting our people. And so a concern that I've been seeing a lot in my job and like in other people who are working is like, how is AI going to walk this line between making labor more efficient and destabilizing workforce? So I'm wondering, like, have you been a part of any conversations within the EU around how to develop that infrastructure that protects labor and protects workforce?
Yeah. I mean, we've had discussions in the European Union. We've had, like, I mean, universal income. I mean, Finland has experimented with it. I mean, when I was in Brussels, kind of like a couple of years ago, we did the future of work. So we have social protection systems. We look at which social protection systems are best equipped to deal with like transitions. I mean, and the flexicurity model, for example, of the Nordics, of the Scandinavian countries are quite interesting because they provide with a lot of security in between jobs. But the flexibility, so you get social security like for 6 months. They pay you the salary that you had before. You're being retrained with proactive labor market policies, and then you transition into a new job. So it's a jumping board. It's not a hammock, the social security system. In this country, surprisingly, I find there's not much attention for like what the social impacts of this technology are going to be, which of course are also going to affect like what we would tend to call the white collar jobs. I mean, if you're a computer programmer, I mean, you should be a little bit worried because the ChatGPT is pretty good at computing I mean, it's a substitute. It's not a substitute yet, but you can probably have one programmer that can, with the help of ChatGPT and correcting it and sending new prompts in, you can do the work that previously was done by 10 programmers. So even in this part of the world, I mean, there is going to be the impact on the labor market for people who have kind of made a living out of programming. And when you think about this, I mean, this is incredible, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here. I think in the history of humanity, we've never faced a situation where change is coming at it so fast. When you look at the Industrial Revolution, I mean, yes, I mean, it took 50, 70, 80 years. I mean, even the internet. I mean, internet came in the beginning of the 90s, and then we had e-commerce and all of these things, and the social media companies. It's been 15 years. We had some time to prepare, and all. It was disruptive, but not as disruptive as this technology is going to be. I made the mistake the other day to ask somebody, an expert, like, well, how do you think the things will look like 1 year from now? He looked at me and said, well, nobody knows. I mean, ask me like next week or maybe next month, and I might give a reasonably intelligent answer. But this is going so fast. So this is not like, okay, we have 5 years, 10 years to prepare ourselves. This goes much faster. And this is like, I mean, this is my personal comment here. I think the fact that we in Europe have quite well developed social protection systems will be important, because people will face situations, I mean, in this country, and again, I mean, I have an easy life here. I'm a diplomat here, so I have the European holidays, my healthcare. But when I look around in this, I mean, and not maybe the Silicon Valley people, but more like, say, call it the ordinary Americans, it's a tough life. No, I mean, if you lose your job because your healthcare is linked to your job, I mean, you can maybe not pay your mortgage anymore. They give you 3 months of salary. I mean, for a European, pretty scary. This kind of and I think this is one of maybe the reasons why in this country populism. I mean, people who are like where their economic security is very low. I mean, they tend to buy in. They have a degree of like concern, frustration, anger, maybe that's more easily fueled with populism. And so, if then you get this massive revolution, which will be driven by AI, and people are going to be faced with kind of jobs that, I mean, the job losses and needing to move into other jobs, might not necessarily have the qualifications for other jobs immediately. To have a social protection system in place with active labor market policies as we have in the European Union, I think is really important for social cohesion, for stability, for democracy in our country. So I'm a little bit surprised in this country that this is not a conversation that you should have. Like, yes, we can talk about, I mean, extinction type of issues. I was at a meeting, I mean, with really kind of impressive people. I mean, the other day, 2 days ago, and the first question we were asked, so it was like an opening, like an introduction, and the question was, "What's your P-doom prediction?" And I didn't know. I thought P-doom. What kind of did I mishear? What was it? And then I found out it's the chances of human extinction in this. So I mean, and it was quite. I mean, I said, look, I'm really shocked that we're talking about this at all. I mean, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about these issues. But so this was very much, I think, the whole, or a large part of the conversation at this point is maybe not so much about the upside of AI, but it's very much about the doom scenario, doom and gloom scenario, but not also about like what it does to our society, how we as a society, and particularly as policymakers, can prepare for these effects that are going to play out over a very short period of time and are going to affect literally millions of people. This is a societal challenge that we have never experienced before, and I think this country and ourselves, we will not be ready for it. But I think in the European Union, with the social protection systems, at least we have some kind of buffer, shock kind of absorber that maybe in this country you're lacking.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. I think we have time for one more question. Please.
Thank you. I just would like to ask...
do you mind saying your name first, please?
Yes. My name is Ursula Rojas. I would like to ask, what is your opinion about the recent calls to pause the research and deployment of... Is that realistic? Is that something that is... And particularly from who has been signing and supporting these, calls?
Yeah. I mean, we've spoken with the people, many people who signed this, and I think they did not have the expectation that actually people would listen. It was more like what you would say in
a PR stunt.
Not a PR stunt. I mean, in French you would say cri de coeur. It's like a warning. I mean, be aware. It's an awareness raising. There is something here. You need to think about it. This is kind of potentially very disruptive and maybe even risky, and so think about it. But I think nobody, I mean, once a genie is out of a bottle, it's very difficult to put the genie back into the bottle again. And we've also seen no evidence of like slowing down on this, other than we've seen evidence that the CEOs themselves are now calling publicly for guardrails. I mean, Tristan Harris, who is the protagonist of the Social Dilemma, which you may have seen on Facebook, he's called this the race to recklessness. These companies are also in a competition. I mean, if you see OpenAI, Microsoft associated with it, I mean, the Bing, I mean, integrating this into the Bing search engine, I think taking Google a little bit by surprise. Obviously, Google is very dependent in terms of its revenue on search. So to expect these companies to say, okay, we are going to stop, and in the meantime see others maybe move further away, it's not realistic. This is not kind of how companies typically work. I think what is important is that we have this conversation, and that we stopping is not kind of that's not the solution. I mean, because we will also deny ourselves huge benefits. The upsides of AI are tremendous, and probably indispensable for us in order to, for example, address the major risk of climate change. I mean, I don't think without AI we're ever going to succeed addressing the climate change. So we must not, at the same time, deny ourselves all the opportunities of AI. But I think what we need is, and I think that's now what's happening, is to come together as a society and not just industry and say, okay, so how are we going to maximize the opportunities of AI, which are important, and how are we going to minimize the risk? And that we need to do very, very quickly. And you see, at least in every forum, whether it's the G7 or the G20 or European Union or transatlantic EU and US, or also with the Global South. And let's not forget, there's a very important dimension of the Global South, because we are talking here about AI. I mean, the developing countries can benefit enormously from AI. I'm coming back. One of the projects that we are undertaking is to give developing countries access to data and AI in order to deal with the extreme weather events. We have a project in the European Union called Destination Earth. We are building a digital twin of the Earth. And with the data that we are collecting massively, for example, through Copernicus, which is an initiative of the European Union, we can predict or help predict extreme weather events. I mean, last year in Germany, 200 people died in flooding, which would not have been necessary because it was very possible to predict like how the water would spread out over Germany and which villages would be at risk and how much time these people would have to kind of be evacuated. But of course we didn't use that data, and people unnecessarily lost their lives as a result. And I think if we can give that data and keep it not just to ourselves but also make it available to the Global South, and these governments can take measures against extreme droughts, against kind of the impact of the rising seawater levels, I think that is also a positive. So we must not forget the Global South. And more generally also, I mean, when you talk about democracy and autocracy, we are in a world now where there is a battle. I mean, democracy is at risk. We're under threat, and there's autocracy, etc. We must also show, I mean, democracy will prevail if we can show that democracy brings greater benefits to people, is a superior model to autocracy. If you look at ChatGPT, the first thing that China did was ban ChatGPT because they didn't want people to see what happened in Tiananmen Square, which the anniversary we remembered like a few days ago. So the issue about stopping it is not realistic. We need to channel it, and this is what policymakers and kind of leaders and emerging leaders are for. You need to kind of channel it and shape it in a way that benefits humanity, that benefits people, and where we mitigate the risk and the downsides. And this, in this case, needs a global effort, which is challenging because the world hasn't been more divided since a long time. But it has to be done.
Oh, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Gerard, put your hands together.